moment to unmute. We'll just give a moment to unmute and start videos for Officer Bradley and Officer Galvan. We'll get going in just one moment. And Ashley, could you just move on to the next slide, please, and we'll get going. So before we got into our formal workshop discussion, this is just a brief disclaimer slide that the Bureau of Justice Assistance has provided funding to put on this event, though any opinions expressed in this document or throughout our discussions today do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. And next slide, please. You've all probably had an opportunity to view a couple of our workshops and peruse our organization's materials. Here's some brief information on the Tribal Law and Policy Institute generally for your reference. As you see, we're a Native American operated nonprofit, and our team specifically provides technical assistance and training to tribal justice systems. If any of you are interested in a training for your programs, feel free to contact us at wellness@tlpi.org. Next slide. Now, we're very fortunate to have two extremely experienced tribal police officers today, Maria Galvan and Francis Bradley Sr. I'd like to briefly turn it over to Maria first, and maybe you could just introduce yourself to the audience and maybe lay out your background.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria Galvan. I'm a criminal investigator with the Pueblo Laguna Police Department. I have been in law enforcement for about 14 years. I'll be starting my 11th year with the Pueblo Laguna now in July. I started on patrol. I've been with the court's wellness court program for at least the last 7 or 8 years. And that's where I first was introduced to the type of work the Tribal Law and Policy Institute provides to show how, we can take the program and fit it to our specific areas, and how we can share information with each other on what may work in one place and what may work in the other. So it's been a pleasure to be asked to speak with everyone today. Again, just so we can all share ideas and learn different ways, especially with this last year and everything everyone has had to go through. I think these kinds of trainings and these kinds of get-togethers are very important, just so that we can we tell people that we need to be there for each other. Well, this is another way, and I think this is a good way for service providers to be able to share ideas.
Thank you so much, Officer Galvan. I will now move on to Officer Bradley. If you could just provide a brief introduction about your professional history and tribal affiliation, possibly.
Thank you. First of all, yate everyone, Francis Bradley and Dorjini born for Kiani, which obviously tells you I'm Dene. Currently, I'm working for the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation as a police officer. Prior to that, I've had let's just put it this way. I've been in law enforcement for 40 years now. I started with the Navajo Nation, worked there for 20 years, retired from there in 2002, went to work for the Wallapai Nation as their chief of police for 16 years. And I've come totally full circle back into the field, back on the patrol with the Fort McDowell Yavapai Nation. This is where I'm going to finish my career out and move forward into the life of the retiree, as they say. We'll see how long that lasts. But nevertheless, I've been all over the country, done a lot of representation for Indian country in a lot of different matters, subject matter expert for a lot of different things, and have had the privilege of meeting a lot of our Indian country peers and been able to see a lot of different things insofar as how public safety in Indian country is conducted. So with that, let's see. Oh, geez. I'm a graduate of the FBI National Academy, session 232. So hey, all those out there who are in the National Academy, hello to my brothers and sisters out there. But nevertheless, thank you for having me here, Jordan and Maria, for presenting with me today. So let's get started.
Thank you so much to both of you again. Now, we had a really robust discussion at last year's enhancement training during a similar workshop. And as we were kind of planning the workshops and agenda for this year's enhancement training, we wanted to make sure to kind of revisit what we discussed last year during this workshop. So thank you to any of you that may have attended last year, and welcome to anyone that is viewing this workshop for the first time. Obviously, a lot of things have changed over the last year, and both bad and good in terms of best practices for law enforcement. And there's a lot of things to reconcile that we'll be looking at over the next few years as we kind of go into this new post-pandemic new frontier in terms of law enforcement's role in treatment courts. So with that being said, once again, thank you to our panelists. And Ashley, if we can move on to the next slide, please. So as you see, we have a general skeleton for what we'll be discussing today. We're going to go over general concepts of community policing with both Officers Galvan and Bradley today. And we'll also plan to discuss their insights on the events that have occurred over the past year and those effects on our communities and on our respective programs. We'll also talk about just generally some of the work that both of our panelists have been involved in. Next slide, please. So our hope today is you'll get a little bit out of this workshop. I know that it's quite an information dump over the course of this week. There's so much to absorb, and we welcome you to watch our recorded sessions. Anything that is presented during this enhancement training will be recorded and available in the virtual environment. Now today, we're hoping that we can just kind of get the general concepts down of generally why it's important to have law enforcement involved in our treatment courts, to provide some really unique perspective that both Officers Galvan and Officer Bradley have based on their deep experience. And we also just want to kind of discuss the events of the last year and some general common talking points that we've touched on previously, including cultural considerations, technology's use in law enforcement, mutual aid, and recruitment strategies. Next slide, please. So just to set the table, as we all know, as part of our Healing to Wellness Court key components and part of our core teams are law enforcement. Now, when we're out in the field, it's a mixed bag of what we've seen out there. There's a continuum of very little contact between a police department and a treatment court, and there are other programs that have a specific officer that is assigned to that wellness court docket. Now, as we all know, there's a couple different things that law enforcement can provide in the context of Healing to Wellness Court. A few of those are listed here for you to read on your own. But in terms of getting the discussion started, I suppose I'd start with you first, Officer Galvan. I'm wondering what your firsthand experience with law enforcement's role on drug courts has been, and if you have any specific examples or stories that your team or a participant benefited from in terms of law enforcement's role. So we'll start with the first part of that question is, what's your experience with the role of law enforcement on a drug court team?
So I was first introduced to the drug court team when the person who was there previously was being promoted to another position. At that point, I didn't know what wellness court was. I knew that they had teen court. When I worked for the state police, they had teen court and they had diversion programs, but I had no idea what wellness court was. I had no experience with it. My experience with court was citing people into court, going to get going to go and do the ticket process with them, and then that was it. So when I joined the team, I'm the type of person that if I'm going to be doing something, I'd like to know why and what the purpose of the group is. And I was fortunate to have a very, very good group of people around at that point. The two people that started the Wellness Court program in Laguna, Mark Daya and Christina Pacheco, they were very, very good, very good. I mean, they sat with me and they explained every single angle of what the program meant and what they saw for me in the program and how I could help them. And it was interesting to see, because my mother is actually a counselor. So I'm familiar with, different things on how like counselors will, engage with law enforcement as well. And so it was interesting to see just how similar that kind of stuff is and how close everyone works. So the very first time I think I went out on a welfare check with them to a house to check on a participant. And that was the first time that I had ever dealt with that particular person. And it was interesting to see just how once they saw that I was there as part of the court team and not there, investigating or recording or going to arrest or whatever, it changed their perception of who I was. And it made it easier to be able to communicate, what was going on. Well, what kind of help do you need? Because they always say that, you can't, if you become a police officer, you don't become a police officer to help people, because how do you help people? Well, this is a prime example of how an officer can help someone. If you know these people and you get to know these people on a personal basis, because you have your repeat offenders and you can see when they decide that they want help. And sometimes when it's that time that they want help, they don't have access to the right people. But if you're familiar with these people and they know that there's this option and you're the gatekeeper for that option, it makes it a lot easier, because then they know, hey, here's a resource for you and I will help you. And it's amazing to see them from start to finish. You do your welfare checks, you do your home checks, you see them weekly, and you see how they grow and they learn. And then once they complete the program and they're on their own, and you see them in other circumstances, like I was also the school resource officer at the time, and you see them at like their children's events, and they're not afraid to come and talk to you. And I think that that's why having a police representative and one who believes in the program and that knows that the program can work is very important, because you can, not only do you become their eyes and ears, but then once they're done, they can tell you, you know what, this person is a person that I used to do what I was doing with. Can you talk to them? Can you help them? I think they're ready for this. And it's nice to see how the tables will turn and they become an ally for you within the community. And it's just, there's so many stories of so many people that have gone through the program that you see them now and they're doing so great. And then you have the other side of the coin where you have people who have gone through the program and unfortunately they've relapsed, but you still see them and you still talk to them and there's still that bond there where they know that you somewhat understand what they're going through. And they will talk to you before they talk to another officer if that officer responds first. And it's a good connection to have, especially with the wellness court, because then I can call somebody from the wellness court team, whether it's, their probation officer or another member from the team, you know, to say, hey, this is happening with this person, or I just talked to this person, you won't believe how good they look. And I think that for me, that's been the most rewarding part, is knowing that in some small way, we being a part of the wellness court, you do make a difference. You may not see it right away, but as they progress through the program and they progress on with their life afterwards, you can see that, you know what, okay, this is working. So how can we make this, who else can we talk to? You know, our wellness court participants sometimes are really good judges of who should be in the program. And them just sitting there talking with you, telling you, you know what, I don't know if this is going to work out, or it's a really good relationship to see. And I think that has been the best part of the connection between wellness court and the police department, is because you bridge that gap with the community, which is what you want. And it just, from there, it just kind of snowballs until you get everything coming at you. And I think that's probably the best part of the treatment team, is that's how you bring everybody in. You know, it's all inclusive. It's not just us and them. It's everybody together working for this common goal. And it's a big support system.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much for that, Maria. Now, I'm wondering, I'll turn to Officer Bradley now. I know you've served in a leadership role as a chief of police with a tribal police department, and also as an officer in the field. I'm wondering how you view law enforcement's role in tribal communities.
Well, first of all, Jordan and Maria, let's start back in the way my history started here. I worked for the Navajo Nation for 20 years, and in working with the nation, I went from being a police officer through the ranks up to leaving as the acting chief of police, but we didn't have a wellness court component or set up within our organization for that 20 years that I worked for the nation. Moving on to the Wallapai tribe, they had finished their grant and other things where they did have a drug court and a wellness court, but that had ended because of funding. So being there for that 16 years that I was with the tribe, we still didn't have that wellness component with the court. There was that relationship with the court and the people we dealt with, but it wasn't in the wellness context until I moved to the Fort McDowell tribe. And in working, one of the first things that I had learned when I got there, and again, this is going roundabout. I came from being in the big leather chair to ground pounding again and driving a marked unit and being out with people. One of the things that I learned through my field training at the time I spent, and yes, I went through a 13-week field training, just like any other officer, new officer would do. Here I am, this chief, and I get put back in with a field training officer to learn how the department works. So in that process of field training, it's when I got introduced to the wellness component and our responsibility as patrol officers for the wellness court and how we participated with that. So with that, the officer who was training me, who was explaining this to me, he says, we're going to go do a wellness check. So I said, okay. And here it is, looking at my watch, and it's like, hey, it's almost midnight here, and we're going to go knock on somebody's door. He says, yes, this is part of what we do to make sure that they know that the people who are in the wellness court participants, that they know we're going to be coming to check on them, and that this is how we solidified a relationship about maintaining their not only sobriety, but following the rules and everything as part of their participation in the wellness court. So, okay, so we go knock on the door. And there's a young couple that lived at this house. And this is, like I said, around midnight. And we get to talking to them. They answer the door, grudgingly answering the door. We woke them up and got to talking with them. And that was my introduction to the wellness court function of what we do. So as time went along from that point, we had to do reports and everything for the court, and all the way up to making sure those went through to my sergeant, who was at the time and still is, he's back as the wellness court coordinator for the department and the court, giving him those reports, and he gave those reports to the wellness team, and they all got together and discussed all these things. So that was how I got introduced to it. And I thought, wow, this is totally different than looking for somebody on a probation violation, and when they've done something to break their word with whatever it was they were supposed to do in their wellness treatment plan. And so it was totally different. So from that point, that's what interested me. That really caught my attention is, hey, this is the opposite of what we're doing trying to enforce the law. We're trying to maintain that person's well-being and peace, and having them work not only for themselves, but to meet the objectives of what the wellness court set out. So that's how I got introduced to it. And from that point, we kept moving forward. And it's an interesting concept because that's just like what Maria is talking about. No longer do they view as that person who's coming to look for them because they did something wrong. They're looking for you to come and check on them, because that's what, not only what they need, but they also are looking for that support that you provide them. And that's the biggest component right there that I see that we've provided for people who are in the wellness program, is that we're just another human being just like they are. And we start to talk about and get to know each other. And as we learn more about each other, we learn more about what it is. You know, I'm a human being just like they are. And we've probably grown up in similar circumstances and had similar things going on within our families that led them to where they are, but took me on this path over here, which is exactly the case. And that's always the story I share with them, because everybody thinks that, oh, you grew up with the golden spoon in your mouth, and that's not the case. So having that one-on-one contact and humanizing yourself as that person who's there to help them through the system is what our biggest component is. And that's what I learned in working for the Fort McDowell tribe up to this point now, and being part of the wellness team. I also had the privilege of, it's been a couple of weeks now, I actually got to go in, and since the restrictions have been lessened and loosened up, I actually got invited in by my sergeant to sit in on a wellness hearing. And although part of it was telephonic, part of it was in person, the judge was there and most of the team, but I got to listen to the interaction between the client and the team and the things that were talked about and asked, and also got pat on the back and kudos for coming by and checking. And the young man was very appreciative of the fact of the matter that we check on him and we come and see him in the role that we're coming to see him in, is a support, as a person of support, not as a person of enforcement, but as a person of support. And it was at that point that I really got to learn how important that one-on-one contact is to the people who are in the system. And it also showed me that there are far more things that you can do and that help in the position we're in to help people get back on their feet, stand on a more solid ground, and then look at life in a better perspective. You know, because they always say in the Indian way, you know, you always look for things that are better, or you always look for things in a good way. And that's what we provide in doing that. You know, yeah, people relapse, people stumble, people fall, but then you get them back up and you start moving them forward. But that's how I got introduced to it. And I'm fascinated by Wellness Court, the Wellness Court, and then what it does, because it helps reduce recidivism. I also met a gentleman who just came out of rehab as well. And he told me his story. And from that, it was like, wow, you know, this is interesting. And he asked me, just make sure you come by and see me when I'm watering my grass. Let's talk, you know, and it's like, whoa, you know, that kind of involvement and that kind of communication with people is what we're all about. That's how we help and take care of each other. That's what it's a community policing role, you know, that we're solving a problem for not only the community itself, but for the person themselves who have an issue or a burden that they need to share or need help with. So that was how I got introduced to it.
Thank you so much. And you both kind of set the table, I think, for a couple of things that we're going to discuss in the next few slides. But Officer Galvan, you brought up an interesting point about law enforcement serving as the eyes and the ears of the community and the court. And I'm wondering, with the events of the past year and with many treatment courts going to primarily a teleservice model, while law enforcement is still out there dealing person to person, how has that eyes and ears type role changed over the last year from your observations?
It actually became a little bit more interesting. The tribe that I work for, when the pandemic hit, they shut down. They have, within the Pueblo Laguna, we have villages, and each village has their own officials. and the officials decided, you know what, we're shutting down, or the governor decided we're shutting down. So the officials decided that they would close off any and all routes into out of each village, and they actually put up checkpoints, and you had to have permission to come and go. Like if you were an essential employee, you had to have letters and permission from the tribe to go in and out at certain times because they had curfews. So it was interesting to see just how much more information we got from the people that were actually helping out with those checkpoints, because it wasn't just a certain group of people. It was the menfolk had to volunteer to come and work these checkpoints with the officials. And for the longest time for the pandemic, I was on graveyard, and a lot of the checkpoints would be done by like maybe 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock at the most, because they would open back up at 5 for people to go to work. So it was just interesting to come and sit and see what these men were seeing coming in and out of their village. We're actually assigned certain villages because they have village meetings every so often. And so I would check on my village more so than the others. And just to sit and listen to what these guys were seeing, who was coming, who was going, how they were doing, you know, if they were unfortunate and lost their jobs, or if they had gotten sick, or, you know, if they needed any extra help. And it was interesting to see just how much the community stepped up as eyes and ears for things that were happening. So it was interesting to see just how much more of a resource those people could be as well, into helping you with your program, because it's a lot of times it's no secret on the res, you know, like who's participating in what, and how long they've been participating, and what they're somehow some people even know the requirements of some of these people that have to be participating in different things. And it's nice to see that, you know what, they say, you know, maybe you should go check on this person, or these kind of people have been coming to this place. Maybe you guys should go drop in and, you know, and check on them and see, you know, it's been interesting to see just how much more communication has opened up. But then you also have the downside of there's some people that they have the lack of communication because once everything shut down, so did they. Mm-hmm. And those were the ones that were a little bit harder to check on. But now that everything is opening back up, I think people were excited they missed the communication with people. Mm-hmm. And I think now, hopefully we can keep the kind of communication that was coming in before, we can also keep that going now. But it's going to be nice to be able to go back and do in-person things, and not just, oh, hey, you're home, you're okay, you're good, all right, fine, and then head out. You know, it's going to be nice to be able to go and sit with someone and say, how are you? How did this impact you? And is there something that you need from us? You know, but I think eyes and ears, especially with this type of program, because they always say that you need a village. It takes a village, you know, and it really does, especially with this kind of program, because, you know, sometimes you need people who aren't experiencing what you're experiencing to listen to you and give you their point of view, because they may see things differently than what somebody who's going through the exact same thing as you sees. And it's always good to get different kinds of feedback, especially from people who know you. You know, if you've grown up in the community, people are watching you no matter what you do. It's just nature of the beast. But it's always good to have that feedback when you're trying to be the eyes and ears of this community, but you have something that shut you down so bad that you had to reach out other places. And I think that was one of the big things, was the community stepped up in a big way, big time.
That's really interesting. And it sounds like what you're getting at is you almost served, particularly with the odd situation where you had checkpoints and closures of roads, is that as a police officer, you served as like a hub but continued to serve as like that communicator between both participants and the community as a whole. I'm wondering, Officer Bradley, if you had any thoughts about maybe what you've observed in terms of community monitoring and how that's looked over the last year.
It's interesting in that point there, because in Fort McDowell, we didn't shut down and neither did the roadways. What did go into effect were the curfews and the service shutdowns. That was in Fort McDowell itself. Now let's take where I live in Peach Springs, Arizona, where the Wallapai tribe is located at. To where my wife and I currently live and work, or she lives, we both live there and she works there. But what they did is that, just like what Maria's talking about, they set up checkpoints for the major places within the community where you come in and out. They blocked roads and set up checkpoints, recruited from the tribal members to be the ones who monitor who's coming and going. And they worked in conjunction with what they put together as the incident command team, which was people from the public, not only the public safety services, but the Indian health services as well, and the tribal programs. It was all made up. That's who the incident command team was. And what that showed is that public safety or law enforcement was just a small part of that incident command team. They handled the emergencies and did those kind of things and continued their services, but the community themselves pulled together, and through the incident command team and setting up that checkpoint and other structure, they're the ones who monitored each other. That's who found out who who got COVID, who needed food, who needed this, who needed that, who was coming and going when there was, people moving in and out of the community, those kind of things. So that in itself really pulled a community together to, again, I'm going to go back to the community policing portion of it, is the people were taking care of themselves. And law enforcement was just one component of that. Fire and EMS were just one component of that. And those emergency service providers did continue to do what they were doing, provide emergency services, but it was that hub, the incident command team that did that, who put together, maintained, and made sure that everybody was following the local rules and regulations, right down to where they commissioned their community members to enforce the laws associated with the pandemic, which in the civil realm is what you really want to go, is make sure that you have the resources available to enforce those curfews and those things associated with that, which I give them kudos for, because it really helped. And it took the burden off of law enforcement, the limited resources that they had, to make sure that they were there for emergencies. So that was one part of it. Now, getting back to the Fort McDowell side, what we saw as a result of everything shutting down was a rise in probation violations. But at the same time, that rise in probation violations didn't automatically mean people were going into detention or jail, is because that service in itself was being limited as well. So we had these documented cases of probation violations, and once things got to a certain point, I guess you could say, is when we had to take whatever action was necessary to bring that person back into the realm of following rules, which meant a lot of times to take them into detention. So that's what we saw with that. Again, the communication that was there on the Wallapai side, I see that as a big kudo. On our side, what it ended up doing with us is it created a lot of distance, and in some cases we had no contact. It was call me on the phone, or it was a distance contact, which again, that doesn't do well for people. It really doesn't. When you limit your contact with them, or you distance them and you're masked up and distanced from them, that just creates a negative environment. So that was the first thing we suffered from, is that distance or no contact policing that we were trying to do, or community policing that we were trying to do, and it didn't help us very much. But then again, you look at it from the safety protocols that need to be put in place and the things that needed to happen to keep the field force and the essential service workers and our community members safe. So everybody was affected and had to deal with that realm of, we've got to do it this way. And of course, the tribal leadership in themselves, every one of our tribal leaderships across the Indian country, everyone stepped up to take measures that were needed to ensure the safety of the people and the communities in Indian country.
Thank you for that. Ashley, would you mind moving on to the next slide, please? So we're getting some really interesting nuggets of information here then, just based on what the field has looked like over the past year in the face of a pandemic. I did want to go over just another kind of like informationally dense slide for our audience as like a breakup here. But as a key component of healing to wellness courts, evidence has shown overwhelmingly that having an active law enforcement officer as part of your team leads to both lower recidivism rates in addition to lower crime rates per the information that's included on this slide. It's also been shown through various studies that if a law enforcement officer is involved on a healing to wellness court team, then you're going to be seeing a higher rate of graduations and success, just based on some of those functions that both Officers Galvan and Officer Bradley have kind of gone over in our initial discussions. So with that being said, we're just going to slide over to the next slide on the deck here. And we're just going to kind of cover cultural considerations for law enforcement in community policing. So I'll go first with Officer Bradley. I know you've presented at length on this topic. And I was just kind of wondering if you could lay out for us maybe a general definition of community policing or your experience with it, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Jordan. Well, first of all, when you look at it, community policing in the Western world is, they say it's a new concept of how policing is to be done. And what it really boils down to are three different things: community partnerships, organizational transformation, that means within the organization providing service, which is law enforcement, and then the problem-solving techniques, or the problem-solving tactics and techniques like the Sarah model, that is utilized, especially during westernized community policing. I mean, that's the way you really look at it in this day and age. But when you go back and look at it from the native perspective or the tribal perspective, you look at it from the standpoint of tribal communities have been practicing community policing for 200 years plus. You know, that's where we get into what it is to have a community. And when you have a community in a tribal nation or a tribe, there are two distinct concepts here. You have relational policing, they say, and then distantal policing. Those two things are another big component of tribal community policing, because first of all, everyone is related in a tribal community in one way or another, whether it be by clan, band, area, location, type of role they have within the tribe or the nation, those kind of things. And then the distal side comes from, we're all spread out all over and we live in different places. So those are two big components of why when you look at community policing with tribal nations, that's the biggest difference there, distal and relational policing. Then when you look at it even further, is you look at the traditional roots that we have as Native people, how we're related to not only each other, but we're also looking at it from what our relationship is within nature, within the world we live in, within the context of where things are at that time in the moment we're in. So you look at it from that standpoint, but you always go back and look at it in general for what you were taught. What is the philosophy that you follow? What's the role of the community, especially the role of the warriors? So the traditional roots of policing in the Indian country come from peacekeeping in general. That was what everyone followed, is peacekeeping. Like when you talk about it from the Navajo side, you look at it from what's called, how are you related? Again, to the things around you, to the people in your nation or your tribe, or even your neighbors. Now, how are you related together? So is a key component of that. The other component of that is peacekeeping. Peacekeeping is the major role that was put on the entire community and all the people in it. Again, when you look at it from the Navajo perspective, they say that when you're born, you take on your mother's clan. and that's how you're identified. So I'm Kiani, which means I'm Toricini, or I'm Toricini, born for Kiani. My dad's Towering House, my mother's Bitterwater. So Bitterwater is the clan that I'm born for. So anyone who is in this meeting with us today, or with this webinar today, who's Toricini or Kiani, we're related in one way or another. So you look at it from that standpoint. Again, that's another way of looking at how tribal community policing is. And then you look at it from the standpoint of what is it that our responsibilities are. Again, the male folk, it's not necessarily males, but it's also the women in our community. They call it the Nabaha principle, which is the warrior way. When you look at it from that standpoint, they call it the warrior way because when you're talking about that, there are things that you have to look at in what you do for your community. So Gehe is one thing, the warrior way is another, because the principles of service fall into that. The principle of teamwork, of having the appropriate tools and things that you need, setting goals and being and having compassion, belief, and being consistent in what you're doing. That's what helped with the harmony of everything. So that's another way of you looking at how community policing differs from the Western world to the native world. And when you look at that, tribes in general, there was always a way to fix something or find something. The talking circle, the ceremonies, the song, the herbs, the ceremonies, everything that took place. And all of those things were always, like Maria said earlier, it always was done in community partnerships. It's like right now, my family is getting ready for one of my youngest granddaughters. Her Kenalta ceremony is coming up. Her coming of age ceremony is coming up at the end of this month. And we're all getting ready for that. You know, not only on my side of the family, my daughter's husband's side of the family, but my in-laws as well. That's the community partnership side you look at. Is it's an event celebrated, an event participated, where everyone has a role in that. And that's what we look at from the community peacekeeping side. And it's the peacekeeping side that is the important side for communities, especially when we talk about law enforcement, because that's where it comes from, is how the community cares for itself. And when you think about all of those in general, one of the things that we tend to forget a lot of times is that when we talk about community policing in the country, it really consists of traditional law, customary law, natural law, and then common law. And that's where that all comes from. So that's kind of a real quick spiel about how Westernized policing differs from tribal policing, and how those two, you have to mesh them together for the modern times where we are now. But that's kind of an overview of it.
That is really interesting. I think that's a really good point that you bring up, that many of our tribal communities have been practicing within our own notions of justice and peacemaking, those concepts that are defined within the Western framework of community policing. So I do think that's a really important point that you brought up, particularly for the work that we do as it's Indigenous space, and we're working within our own communities. Now, I'm wondering, Officer Galvan, what has your experience been with building the bridge between a law enforcement officer's role and the community, as someone who's not just an enforcer, but someone that is a peacemaker within your own experience?
It's been interesting. I grew up in northern New Mexico, and the closest tribe there was Dulce. And the only time we would spend any time there is when we had a sporting event. So a lot of the things I've learned in reference to tribal communities did not happen until I was employed by the Pueblo of Laguna. And I've been very lucky with all of the people that I've met there, because I know that there are certain things that I cannot participate or partake in. And I have the utmost respect for that, because they have been doing things for centuries before, modern policing was even a concept. You know, they have been taking care of their own ways of doing things, their own protection, their own enforcement, you know. And so it was interesting to see, coming from an organization like the New Mexico State Police into a tribal police setting, where, you know, with the state police, you see tribal police here and there. And it's only if stuff happens on the interstate. And so when I was with the state, you know, I would come out towards the Laguna area, and every time I would get there and get ready to meet these guys and go help them, I'd get called back because they had it handled. And I thought, wow, you know, that's interesting. And so when I started in Laguna, I was really lucky to have a lot of supervisors and coworkers that were very beneficial to my learning of just what a sovereign nation is and how they have adapted policing to fit what they have where they have it. Laguna has Interstate 40 running through almost all of the reservation. So we deal with a lot of non-native traffic, but we also have a lot of other agencies. We cover 4 counties, you know, so that's 4 different places that have 4 different ways of doing things. Then you throw in state police on top of that, plus the BIA, plus the FBI. And it's one of those things where, for me, it's fortunate because I can pick and choose and learn from all these other agencies and bring it back to try and have it fit where I'm working. Whereas the people that I worked with, a lot of them had only done tribal law enforcement. And it was interesting to see how simple they had adapted. Like, it was just such a simple understanding of how this is how we have to do it to continue to uphold our traditions and everything. You know, when I first started working there, the unit that I got had tribal design on it, and it said protecting our customs and traditions. And I think that coming from a state perspective to where it's like, this is the state's way, this is the way you have to do it, no questions asked, to an agency where they value their community, they want their community involved, you know, they want their community to know that they're there for them. And that was I think the best experience for me, was just seeing how involved the community was with certain things, with certain aspects. And then you had the people that were from their own community working for their own police department. And it just made it a lot easier to learn what kind of problem solving strategies they would come up with versus how a state agency would handle it. And I found myself liking the tribal component better than the state component. You know, tribal policing, you know, in some instances you try to find solutions. You try to stick with your customs and traditions. You try to, you know, the recidivism is what they want to avoid. That's what their problem solving strategies and solutions. And that was what was one of the biggest pluses for me with this, working with the agency that I'm in, because, you know, with the state, it was kind of hard. You would go to a call, you'd get your call, you'd finish, and then you'd never really find out how that family was after that life-changing situation that they had. But with the tribe, it's like they want you to help them, but then you're able to go back and say, how are you doing? You know, do you need anything from us? Do you need any resources? Do you have any ideas on how it was handled? You know, do you agree with how it was handled? And it's not to say that you don't know how to do your job, but sometimes coming from community policing, you can find out how you can improve yourself, you know, not only work-wise, but spiritually, mentally. And I think in the end, that's what makes you a better officer. If you really understand your community and the community partnerships that you have, it makes community policing a lot easier, in my opinion.
That's interesting. I'm wondering, both of you seem to be really close knit and very tuned in to your respective communities where you work. One thing that we tend to see sometimes in tribal healing to wellness courts or warn of is to shed ourselves of our biases just based on, knowing this family or being familiar with this individual and trying to address everybody from anew with an individual strategy to bring about their healing in wellness courts specifically. So I was just wondering, just a general question, we could start with Francis. I'm wondering, how have you, or what strategies have you used to eliminate bias within your own mind, or have you even encountered that in your experience working in close-knit communities?
One of the first things I had to learn about was what it is I was supposed to know about. And I was fortunate in the beginning of my career, a lot of the old guard, the older officers, they took you under their wing and they started to tell you, this is how life is here. And this is how life was before we even got here. And this is what life is going to be like after here. And that's a concept for the Navajo way of looking at things. You always remember those who came before you, those who came with you, and those who are going to come after you. So getting that implanted in my mind in the very beginning and starting to learn that there is, and there always will be, some type of history with everyone. And when you look at the basics of what the Navajo is taught is that you forgive. You may not forget, but you forgive the people for the things that happen. And you always look at them. You always look at them and the day, especially like what they did yesterday. This is today. And what do we look forward for them for tomorrow? It was being taught how to look at things without that bias of yesterday. Because we're in today, and what are we going to be looking forward to tomorrow? One of the things and the key concepts that I always tried to teach my teammates is just that. Look at people for who they are, human beings. We're all five-fingered. We all got here the same way. We all have stories about where we've been, where we're going, and where we would like to be. So look at people and look at them in this light that is the most favorable, even though they've had circumstances in their lives that put them in contact with us and where we stand at, we're supposed to look at them with this bias and this mistrust or this lack of trust. But again, my parents had a big role in that, as well as a lot of my teachers. My grandma, my grandpa, my auntie, especially my auntie, she was a healer. And she always used to sit down with me in the beginning of my career and explain to me, remember this, son, remember this, remember peacekeeping, remember your role as Nabahatane. You're a man who's going to go fight an enemy or deal with an illness, fight an illness, or deal with or fight a disease. And remember that when you're in that battle, use your mind, use your body, use your spirit. Be that leader you're supposed to be. And always remember humility, valor, honesty, integrity, and generosity. That's how I was brought up into this. And that's the traditional way of looking at people. So is there this bias? It exists, we know that. But how do you deal with that and problem solve in today's world with that? Is remember those things that you were taught. And that's how you look at people. My team get after me every once in a while. You're standing too close. You're in a bad place. You're in a bad position. Stop. That person is like this or like that. And for me, honestly, I was the way I was taught is that I'm going to put my hand on your shoulder. I'm going to touch your arm, and that's going to tell me everything I need to know about you because this is the way I believe. And I'll know from the simple act of sharing my touch with you. And that's the only thing that we were given that's truly ours. So that's how I share it. And that's for me how I learned how to do this. So is there a bias? Yes. Am I biased on things? Yeah, probably too much salt on this or too much sugar on that, or I like my coffee with this kind of cream and not that one. I mean, that's just the way I look at it. That's the way I was taught. And those are the principles of being a warrior in your society. You're a protector, you're a provider, and you're a peacekeeper. That's also your role as a father, an uncle, a grandpa, a son. It's the same way for our women. You're a mother, you're an auntie, you're a grandma, you're a daughter. And that's the way I was taught.
Thank you so much for that. That's really insightful, and I appreciate the perspective coming from a Navajo perspective specifically. That's something that I haven't been as exposed to. So thank you for that. We're running out of time. We do have about 10 minutes left. If any of the audience members do have questions, please do drop those into the chat box, and we'd be happy to stay on maybe a little longer if we run out of time. But yeah, I did just want to give Officer Galvan a chance as well to respond to that. And just in terms of how you have tried to, I guess, remain objective regardless of your close familiarity with your community.
Well, I'm a curious person by nature. And so I want to know if something's working, how and why is it working? And I completely agree with Officer Bradley that when I was younger and, my grandmother retired so that she could watch my siblings and I. And a lot of things that we learned from her as well as my parents was that it doesn't matter who they are, you have to respect the person. Now, you may not agree with their opinion, you may not agree with how they do what they choose to do with their life, but you still have to respect that person. And, if in this profession, you're given 5-6 seconds to form an opinion based on the behavior of a person when you arrive. Now, that's not enough time to come up with an accurate depiction of who a person is. But you also have to remember that that person is probably at their lowest point at that time. And you can't form bias on that because you don't know what they're going through. You don't know where they've been, where they've come from, how they got to where they were. And, I found that if you just take a little bit of time to listen and you respect the position that they're in and what they're trying to portray to you, it's a lot more beneficial than, like Officer Bradley said, I'm one of those ones also where they're like, well, why are you standing so close to this person? Why are you letting them come, in this area? It's like, because you don't understand. You get that feeling from them. You feel their energy, and yes, you still pay attention to what's going on, but you have to drop all those biases to be able to help that person, to be able to get to where you can help them safely. And it turn out, if they get arrested, okay, fine. But how are we going to safely approach the situation to where this person feels respected, they feel heard, they feel like they're not being ambushed into something that they're not wanting, and you have to be very sensitive to certain situations, especially nowadays with, how things are changing. With the whole pandemic, so many people have lost their homes, they've lost their livelihoods, they've lost family members. And, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. And, the mental health aspect at least in our area has become a hot button topic. And they're wanting to be able to provide the people with more mental health help. And it's you have to take all of that into consideration and remember that they're a person. They're a person. It does not matter what they are going through at that point. They still deserve that respect. They still deserve to be treated like a human. Now, would I want to be treated any differently? No. Would I want to be respected any differently? No. And like Officer Bradley said, it all has to do with how you were raised and how you were taught. I believe that, they say children are our future, but our ancestors are our past, and they build up a lot of who we are, because there are things that you grow up with that you don't see now, and you're wondering, well, why not? Because a lot of it's getting lost in translation. A lot of it's getting lost in being taught. And I think, as long as we remain objectivity is a big thing. And respect is, to me, I think respect is the only way that you will be able to to be able to, I want to say not happily, but keep it to where it's not getting to the point where your bias is overwhelming your respect to people. And that's what officers have to remember, especially with community policing, is that if community policing is not for you and you cannot keep that bias, then okay, maybe there's something else that you should be doing. Because we need to remember that we are all people. We are all one. We're taught that everybody is important. Everybody is a human being. Everybody has problems, but we're all one. We're all one race. We're the human race. And it all boils down to respect. And if you can't give somebody that respect, then you shouldn't push that they should give it back to you. And I think that's a really big thing.
And you both probably covered this in your previous answers at length, but this does tie into my next talking point within the framework of community policing and traditional notions of justice. As an officer or a law enforcement officer in your communities, are there any specific strategies that you have developed or observed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community at large? And that includes elders, those involved in the justice system, and those not involved in the justice system. I guess we could start with Officer Bradley first with that question.
Really, it comes down to remembering what your purpose is and why you're in the role of what you're in. You're the police, so they say, and traditionally throughout time, whether it be Western, European, or even traditional, there was always somebody who was left in that role to provide the peacekeeping. And there were always those who were there to provide the warrior side. So those two were always there. And it's that way today. You have your protectors, you have your providers, and you have your peacekeepers. So with that being said, in that role, what you're talking about there, it comes down to the strategies that are employed come down to what the agency sees for itself, what its mission means, and then what the values are that they're going to provide as individuals in that organization. But it also comes a lot from what your nation, your tribe expects of you also. Those are some real key components about how it is that you're going to provide your service delivery and take care of your people. Everywhere I've always worked, it's come down to, this is our role, this is what we want to do, this is what we see for our people, and this is how we want to deliver it. It's that key component, and I've always taught from the basis of what I know, and that's the Navajo side, and I apply that even to my non-tribal officers who have worked for me. You teach to be a leader, you teach to be a protector, you teach to be a provider, and you teach to be a peacekeeper, because those are your roles in any society. And with that, when you do that, you always, and Maria hit it on the head, you always teach respect thyself, respect all others, respect thy neighbor, and be respectful in all that you do, especially of life. I've always employed that strategy. Even today, I'm not a supervisor, I'm not the chief, I'm not a sergeant, but my teammates, this is what I always constantly remind them of, because we're teammates. This is our job. Look at it from the perspective of who we're serving, Indian country. And I remind our peers on the outside of us, we're a multidisciplinary organization, agency, and service provider. So those who come in to work with us, I remind them, this is how it is to work with us here in our tribal community. So that's a long answer to a short question.
Thank you so much. Officer Galvan, I know you touched on this in your previous answer. Do you have any other examples of connecting with the community or bridging the gap that may exist between law enforcement and community members?
I think the easiest answer would be spend time as a school resource officer. spend time as a school resource officer and go in and sit with the kids. You know, by the time children, young adults are in middle school, they've already started to form their biased opinions. But if you go and you sit with kids that are kindergarten through 4th, 5th grade, and you sit with them consistently and you hear them out, you hear a lot of different things, you know, and they ask so many interesting illustrated questions. And I think, to me, the way to be able to get the community to understand you is to get the youth to understand who you are and what you're there for. Because, you know, they, at that point, their bias is non-existent unless it is taught at home. Now, if you sit down and you go in and you help them with their homework, or they're having, you know, like they have field days at the end of school. A couple of times I scheduled a lot of our units to come in, a fire, ambulance, police, animal control, you know, because they were having that specific unit on transportation. And it's amazing to see that when you get to know the children, then they let their parents know, oh, I met this person and they're super cool. And, you know, you see them out, and I'm still getting it to this day, and I haven't been a school resource officer for quite some time, but kids will come up and then their parents will then you get to know the parents, you get to know the grandparents, you get to know the auntie or the uncle. And I think that's the biggest thing, is to immerse yourself into the community, immerse yourself into the culture, understand why things are and why there are certain things that you cannot participate or partake in, and respect that. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that you have to immerse yourself, especially if it's your own culture. You should already be immersive in it. But I think it just, the easiest way I have found was being a part of the wellness court and being the school resource officer. Plus, I'm more of a, I like to talk to people and not write tickets to people kind of officer. I would rather do that than, you know, that other aspect. I would rather go and sit with you and say, hey, let me buy you lunch. You know, come and tell me what you think about this. Come and tell me what you think about the current climate. Do you have any questions for me? Do you want to know why certain things are the way they are, you know, with the way that I'm providing my services to you? Are there any problems with the way that you think we're providing our services to you? You know, because in policing, the community is our biggest partnership, and it will always be our biggest partnership. So you want to immerse yourself in the community, even if you're not from there. And I think that's the biggest thing, is that, you know, yes, everything Officer Bradley said was correct. You have to follow your rules, your regulations, the expectations set by your bosses. But in the end, you're there to serve your community and protect your community. So you should immerse yourself in that. Get to know people. That's your big eyes and ears there, is when you get to know people, they'll tell you, you know what, this is not right.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. This was a really interesting discussion on cultural considerations and different notions of justice and community policing. Now, I'm going to jump ahead now. Thank you to Ashley for going to this slide. We have a topic here of just the challenges of policing in Indian country that we discussed at length last year. Like we've mentioned today, the events of the pandemic since early last year have kind of thrown us all for a loop in our treatment court settings. I was just wondering, I guess we'll jump over now to Officer Bradley. What sort of challenges has your department experienced, and what challenges have you experienced individually with the events of the last year?
Well, first of all, let's look at the last year in general and what that's really brought forth, not only to Indian country, but our country in general. The reforms that have been called for the changing of how policing is to be done, or how those in policing should be. That's probably been the biggest thing that's brought forth challenges to what policing should be and how it should be in this country. Now, insofar as Indian country is concerned, I have yet to talk to any of my peers to hear about a lot of those generalized challenges that the outside Western world is talking about. Again, a lot of that I attribute back to the simple fact of the matter is that when we police in Indian country, we do it from the traditional side and remember where it is that we are, and we are part of that community. So that's one of the challenges that's brought forth. But being a multidisciplinary agency organization, that affects us greatly because we all deal with everyone, not just our tribal members. When I worked on the Navajo, we dealt with everyone who came to visit us, who lived with us, and who traveled through us. The Wallapai was the same way. I'm in Fort McDowell. We still have that same type. We have people coming in from all over. So those challenges and those views are what is the first stigma that we run into. First of all, you guys are tribal cops. Second of all, you're on the reservation. Third, we're looked at in Indian country as y'all don't know what you're doing, you know, and your laws don't apply to us. But you have to remind people that first of all, you're visiting my nation, you're visiting and getting services from my organization, which is we are a multidisciplinary organization. So let's keep on top of this and work together. So that's one of the first challenges. Second challenge comes back to, again, let's relate this back to the pandemic. It brought up the technological challenges that Indian country has faced over all the years. Some places, some nations, some Indian tribes and nations have really jumped on that bandwagon and upped their technology so that their education, their health services, their services in general could be provided via the internet. Other places didn't have that and still don't. So that technology is a big part of it. And technology in law enforcement is a big part of what we need to have. So again, technological issues that are facing us in law enforcement. And then we're looking at and still trying to figure out ways and trying to find people to work in the field of law enforcement, public safety in Indian country. And that's a big portion of it is there are people out there who are willing to work in Indian country, but are being swayed by what we've seen within the last year about being a police officer. So that recruitment and retention issue still comes to bear in where we are in Indian country. Of course, with recruitment and retention comes lack of adequate salary, lack of retirement. And again, it comes down to we have far greater challenges recruiting and retaining those who come into law enforcement and finding our own tribal members to do that, because there's a lot of times, I don't want to do that because it's a little bit too hard kind of thing. So those are kind of the three areas that I see that challenge us still. So, and the last part of that is the jurisdiction, understanding what jurisdiction and sovereignty is. When you work in it long enough, you can answer the questions just like that. But when you're coming into it and you're trying to figure out, how in the world do I deal with this? You got to be able to understand and find someone who can help you walk through that minefield a lot of times of what jurisdiction can become and is. So those are my takes on it.
Thank you for that. And Officer Galvan, I was wondering, yeah, in your community, it's obviously been a very challenging year. What have you observed?
I completely agree with everything Francis said. Every single thing that he said that they are experiencing is exactly what is happening in our area. You know, we're having to do court remotely for wellness court, and it's hard because the internet service on the reservation sometimes is non-existent, or they're having to work on the lines, or there's places where people will go sit in the middle of nowhere because that's where their hotspot can catch. And it's just, people are having it's yes, we're having our issues with the way that we're portrayed and the way that we're questioned as to why we do what we do. And it technology in that front has not been our best friend, but you have to learn to overcome and adapt, and understand that everybody around the country, police-wise, is feeling that right now. But every single thing that Francis said is exactly, what is happening in our area, retention, technology, everything. It's all, I mean, if word for word, what he said is exactly what is happening in our area. And it's one of those things where you wonder, well, how long is this going to last? It has to get better. It can't get any worse, kind of thing. But I think, if we all remember that, when Francis started, we didn't have the technology then that we have today. So we
Right.
will adapt. We'll adapt and overcome.
Right.
We have to. It's part of our job. We have to adapt, and eventually we will figure out a way to overcome what we're going through right now.
Thank you to both of you for your perspective. And we are coming up on time. There's a few minutes here for Q&A. We just have a thank you, and thank you to our audience as well for attending today. This is a really robust discussion, and I think it'll lead us to some subsequent workshops on some of the broader topics that have come up over discussion throughout the day. So I look forward to future discussions with you both, Officer Galvan and Bradley. Thank you very much. I do want to kind of lay out the table for everyone tomorrow. On Wednesday, we'll be opening with plenary remarks again, opening at 9 a.m. Pacific, followed by our first plenary session, engaging a culturally responsive approach to support juvenile healing to wellness court participants. And we have some awesome representatives from the Blackfeet Juvenile Healing to Wellness Court. So please do join us tomorrow for our plenary session. We'll be doing more raffles for more prizes. And we have some awesome content coming up Wednesday through Friday. I believe Ashley may have dropped the link for a evaluation into the comment section. I ask you all to please complete an evaluation. It helps us develop and improve all of our online and in-person events. You'll see that in the comment box right now. So please do complete your evaluation. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow and later in the week.